I'd like to thank the organizers, particularly Quan Chin, for this invitation and this opportunity to be here. It's particularly exciting to meet members of a stable network, to learn from your long durability, I think 15 years, something like that, and to look forward to more interaction in the years to come. Before I took the plane from Kampala to come here, the news on the airwaves was all about South Africa. There were actually two sets of news, and putting one against the other was quite a sobering thought. The first set of news was about the University of Cape Town, a movement called Rhodes Must Fall, a student movement organized to bring down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, the English colonizer of not only South Africa but also Rhodesia, named after him. And this movement was successful in that the Rhodes statue was removed, and as the movement's agenda said, it would be the beginning of a discussion on decolonization of the University of Cape Town. Around the same time, you had violent riots going on, first in Durban and then in Johannesburg. And these riots, the rioters, targeted black Africans from outside South Africa. They targeted them for killing and then later on for burning. Many of the practices that we became familiar with in the 1980s during the Township Rebellion, necklacing, formation of groups in impi formation, all this was repeated, but now with a grotesque aftermath. You put the two together, you get some sense of where we are at on the continent. On the one hand, decolonization. On the other hand, not yet working out what that means in practice. So the challenge of this particular forum is really decolonization. Decolonization on multiple fronts, economic, political, but also epistemological. So it's this last concern that I'm going to focus on, decolonization in the field of knowledge production. And rather than give you my views on what I think this should mean or ought to mean, what I want to do is just to go over the ground in terms of what we as academics in African universities, what we have made of this over the last 5 or so decades. So let me begin with a brief, sort of a few words on the African university. If you go to the web and you try and read about the African university, you'll get a lot of statements about how there were several universities before the colonial period, a venerable university from the Alexandria Museum and Library to Al-Azhar in Egypt, to Al-Zaytuniya in Tunis, to Al-Qarawin in Morocco, to Sankore in Timbuktu, now Mali. You will get all of this. But the fact is that there's very little connection between these universities and the universities of today. It's an interesting historical fact, but it's not a living fact. Okay, there's no historical continuity between between the universities of the pre-modern period and today's university. Today's university, if you want to look at it in historical development, I would suggest that there are three periods. The first period, the early colonial period, is where you get universities established in the first colonies, which is in the south and the north, whether it's University of Witwatersrand, whether it's University of Cape Town in the south, or in the north, where the pre-modern universities like Al-Azhar were reorganized along lines of the modern Western university, right? So that's why I say that there's very little connection between what used to exist before and what exists today. Then you've got the late colonial phase. The difference between the early and the late colonial phase is that the late colonial phase comes in the early 20th century, and by that time, the colonial powers, particularly Britain, have had a lot of experience in older colonies, especially India. And they have concluded that the civilizing mission is problematic, that if the civilizing mission means creating universities, producing lawyers, educated middle class, that educated middle class is the carrier of nationalism. Lugard, who was the principal British colonial administrator in the 20th century, wrote in his book, The Dual Mandate, that we must avoid the Indian disease in Africa. And the Indian disease, according to Lugard, was the educated middle class. So in the second phase of colonialism, there were very few universities established throughout Africa. There was only one university in British East Africa, Makerere University in Kampala, only one in British West Africa, and that's in Nigeria. So if you take Nigeria, for example, you have one university at independence with 1,000 students, and in 31 years, you have 41 universities with 131,000 students. East Africa is the same. I would say all of colonial Africa is the same. In other words, the African university is predominantly a product of nationalism. It's not a product of colonialism. Okay? It's a product of nationalism. It's a product of insurgent nationalism, and produced by insurgent nationalism, almost on the morrow of independence, it came into conflict with nationalism in power. Okay, so that's the reality. The sandwich, we're sandwiched between these two facts, estranged from those who gave us birth. Now, the institutional form and the curricular content of this university, it should be thought of as the colonial modern, in the sense that the institutional form, it takes on the European university. Right? If you take the European university, with its birth being the University of Berlin in the 19th century, the University of Berlin, where for the first time you had the university as a gated community, curriculum organized in terms of disciplines, fee-paying students, right? Degree-issuing university. This is the model that spreads through Europe, and that's the model that spreads through the rest of the world, and that includes Africa. Okay, it includes colonial Africa. The intellectual content of this university also derives from Europe, and it's a product of the Enlightenment, but in a double sense. It's a product internally of the struggle against the church. So when the notion of the human is born, the notion of the human is born, first of all, against the notion of the Christian. So the notion of the human is more emancipatory, right? It's broader than the notion of the Christian. But there's a second move, there's a second a contest which also gives shape to this notion of the human, and that is an external contest. It is the colonization of the world. It's the colonization of the Americas, of Asia, and finally of Africa. And here, the notion of the human produces a regressive account of not simply what is human, as broader than Christian, but also what is not human. What is not human, right? what is colonizable, what needs humanizing, what needs civilizing. So it's this dual legacy, right, with its two aspects that the university is home to. So let me come to decolonization. So the struggle for decolonization in this African university moved in sort of various phases. The first phase was relatively easy. The first phase is known as Africanization, which was basically decolonization of access, open up the doors, right? The university was racialized, now de-racialize. Students in Uganda, which is not a settler colony, that Sam Moyo was talking about yesterday, but in Uganda, not a settler colony. So the student body was not racialized, but the academic staff was racialized. So de-racialize, open up access, and there's a debate that emerges around access. The existing faculty calls for rights, to respect the rights of all, right? And those who are outside, who are calling for opening up the gates, are calling for justice. And this is the debate. Rights on the one hand, justice on the other hand. Rights as a defense of the existing order, rights as a defense of the status quo, and justice as a reform of the existing order. But those who call for justice also say that since injustice was racialized, justice must also be racialized, right? That a blind for all justice will be no justice. It cannot undo what was done in the past, and this is one of the big debates, okay, in the African context, and today one of the big debates in South Africa. But that's the first step, and as I say, it is still relatively easy. When I went to South Africa first time, talking about 1991, 92, we were taken as a delegation of African scholars, 6 of us, to visit the South African trade unions and the democratic staff association, university democratic staff associations around South Africa. And we went to an UDUSA gathering in Durban. And the big debate at the gathering was around 2 terms. One said excellence, the other said relevance. Right? This was the debate going on. So you had to decode it. Over a few days of the conference, one managed to decode it and to realize that those calling for excellence are calling for the protection of standards and are really calling for a preservation of the status quo. Right? That admissions should be limited to those who deserve to be admitted. There should be no lowering of standards in order to protect excellence. Those who are calling for relevance are calling for a transformation of the system. That this educational system you have created does not respond to the demands of the majority. It does not take on its agenda, as part of its agenda, what are the demands of the majority. So this is the sort of debate. Excellence versus relevance. That debate will continue in phase 2 throughout the other universities in the continent, and I'll give you a sense of it. To step back a little bit, 1960s, University of Dar es Salaam. University of Dar es Salaam, in 1966, the government introduces national service. Students have to go for national service for 2 years. They have to go to a military camp for a certain amount of months, then they come out of it, they go to communities, and something like 400 university students demonstrate and say, we will not go to national service, right? The government dismisses all of them, withdraws their bursaries, they are sent packing home. Right? Next year, the Arusha Declaration is proclaimed. The Arusha Declaration is basically a manifesto which talks of transforming things. The university, just a few months after the declaration, the university holds a conference called Role of the University College Dar es Salaam in a Socialist Tanzania. It's 1967 March. The conference notes that various disciplines and related subjects were not studied in the context of East Africa, and particularly Tanzania's socio-economic development aspirations. Amongst the recommendations of the conference is a continuous curriculum review. Okay, so now we're going beyond the question of access to the question of content. Okay, what is being taught in the university? An internal debate emerges. There are three groups. One group called the radical group. The radical group says that all departments should be abolished. All departments should be abolished. All curriculum should be interdisciplinary. Every student should specialize in a stream, in a particular stream which is interdisciplinary, and where previously formed departments have to collaborate together. So that's the radical view. The majority, which includes most of the small Tanzanian staff, they want a radical curriculum review, but they don't want to abolish the departments. They say let the disciplines remain, but there should be an interdisciplinary core. Right? There should be an interdisciplinary core. And the conservative minority on the right wants no change. They don't want curriculum to change, and they don't want the departments to be removed. After this follows a reorganization. I was hired at that time at the University of Dar es Salaam. It was my first job, 1973. And I was hired to teach the first year of the interdisciplinary core. The interdisciplinary core was a double course, 2 out of 5, on East African society and environment. Right? The second year core was science and technology. The third year core was planning. Okay, so this was the vision. How much time do I have left? $15 minutes? That's good, thank you. The reform began 1969. In the first phase, by 1971, there was tremendous discontent with the reform. The students were opposed to what was going on. They said the interdisciplinary lectures were like mass rallies, political rallies. There was not sufficient content. The standards had dropped. The staff, half the staff resigned, right? Half the staff resigned. These were mostly expatriates. They resigned, they left. And the University Council set up a subcommittee, and the subcommittee expressed one very important worry. Right? The subcommittee said that, look, if you're going to go the interdisciplinary route, then you're going the problem-solving route, and you are likely to produce technocrats rather than thinkers. That was the University Council, right? Technocrats rather than thinkers. This will be a big, big issue. So it's at this point that, again, so you had a revision and you had a phase 2. So when I got there in 1973, the phase 2 had just begun. It was an exciting period because a lot was happening not simply in the classroom, a lot was happening outside the classroom. For example, I give you my example. I was involved in 7 study groups in a week. 7 study groups outside the classroom. Each study group required you to read about 100 to 150 pages a week. And the study group, the first study group, was Each study group was between 2 and 8 people, maximum 8 persons, minimum 2. So there was a study group on Das Kapital. There was a study group on the 3 internationals. There's a study group on the Russian Revolution, study group on the Chinese Revolution, study group on the agrarian question, and then there was a study group on Uganda, special group for Ugandan students. It was a period of tremendous intellectual ferment. If we go by the intellectual production of that period, and I'll come to it in a minute. Now, this question surfaced again at the University of Cape Town in the 1990s, the question of disciplines and interdisciplinarity, except it was the opposite, because in the South African context, the division between the disciplines and interdisciplinarity had been inherited from the West, where the disciplines were the domain of studying the West, white society. And interdisciplinarity was the way areas were studied. Area studies was interdisciplinary. So if you were at the University of Cape Town or Witwatersrand, and you wanted to study the white experience, you went to the Department of Sociology or Economics or Political Science. But if you wanted to study about native South Africans, you had to study area studies, interdisciplinary African studies. African meant native. Okay, African did not mean people who live in Africa. It meant native peoples in Africa. So this was whereas at the University of Dar es Salaam, interdisciplinarity had been seen as a solution to the problem of a context-free set of disciplinary teachings, it was the reverse at the University of Cape Town, where interdisciplinarity was seen as something which had boxed in, as if in a zoo, native peoples for close microscopic study. So it was a different set of concerns. I joined the University of Cape Town. I was hired as A.C. Jordan Professor of African Studies. So I had a big office, and I had nobody to teach. No one. So suddenly I found myself in this office and this salary and everything, but no one to teach. And then the university decided that there should be a compulsory introductory course on Africa, right, for all the students. And then a big debate emerged. What should be the content of this course? So they said, this course cannot teach South Africa. It has to teach north of the Limpopo River. I said, but the whole point of a post-apartheid curriculum is to study South Africa as part of the African experience. So, big fight. Ultimately, I resigned from the university. I left. I also resigned because I got another job. So you can't just resign, you have to feed yourself. So I also got another job. I left anyway. But there was an interesting. So I want to return to this question of relevance and excellence. Okay, because relevance and excellence now begin to become code words of two related but distinct avocations. Relevance becomes the code word of the public intellectual, right? And excellence becomes the code word of the scholar, right? And this debate will go through a series of places, whether it's University of Dar es Salaam, whether it's Makerere University over the last 5-7 years, and particularly CODESRIA. CODESRIA is Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa. CODESRIA begins as a council of directors and then broadens into a council of researchers. Okay, CODESRIA is established in 1973, so it's a very old organization. And CODESRIA does two things. It brings together senior scholars. It brings them together not as scholars, but really as public intellectuals for a set of public debates which are organized as large assemblies. But then it brings together junior scholars in pursuit of scholarship, either in multinational working groups or in national working groups or small grants program which finance PhDs of young scholars. So this is the, now if you follow the debates in Codesria, Codesria was mainly an organization of intellectuals from small countries. Okay, small countries where you had one university, one country, one flag, one national anthem, one university, created on the morrow of independence. And you're on eyeball to eyeball with the government of the day, and you find your freedom in crossing the border, right? Or it took in exiled scholars, say from Ethiopia, for example, after the Ethiopian revolution, lots of scholars leaving. They come into Codesria. But scholars from large countries with many universities, like Nigeria or South Africa, you won't find them in Codesria, few, exceptional, because they have their national associations, they have their national journals, they have a space within the country. So it's people like us, small countries, we came into Codesria. Debates in Codesria, 5 more minutes? Yes. We have the same watch. So the debates in Codesria, the big debate led by Samir Amin, okay, from 1973 onwards. Samir Amin is the first executive secretary of Codesria, then comes in Abdullah Bujra, then comes in Thandikam Kandawire, so on and so forth. Okay, so the first big debate is this question of development, dependency and development, right? And by sort of, it's also the same debate at the University of Dar es Salaam. Okay, the University of Dar es Salaam, Walter Rodney, coming from the Caribbean, Walter Rodney writes How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Big book, okay, big book, sets the terms of a discussion. Very soon after, Issa Shivji writes Silent Class Struggle and Class Struggles in Tanzania. And Shivji is saying in his book, he's pointing his finger not to the external situation, but to the internal situation. And he's saying that, look, the language of socialism is masking capital accumulation by a state-connected bourgeoisie. This is Shivji's argument, basically, right? So this debate emerges at the University of Dar es Salaam. Which is principal, the external or the internal, right? By the time Rodney comes to Kampala and has this big debate with Ali Mazrui, the same debate is on, because Mazrui is saying the question is democracy. Rodney is saying the question is imperialism, okay? And that issue comes into Codesria in the 1980s. At the 1984 General Assembly of Codesria, there is a major demand that a new multinational working group must be created on social movements and democracy. There is too much emphasis on simply one issue, dependency, right? So it moves, Codesria moves to open this, and you have two issues, sort of two principal issues as the focus of Codesria. Let me come to a close. So I think these debates suggest some larger issues, challenges for us. I think one, they suggest the question of the nation state in the era of imperialism. Okay, because it's not this or that. It's how do you relate the two? The nation state in the era of imperialism, right? So how do you make sure that you're able to synthesize in some way two different projects, a project for democracy inside the nation state and a project for some kind of reform of the international arena in the face of empire. So that's one big question. Now, at the same time, I should say, there was very little, there was concern with development and democracy, but there was very little discussion of what we understood by development and what we understood by democracy. We didn't really, neither group discussed this, neither group was able to open up the question of what do we understand by this term development? And what do we understand by the practice of what we are calling democracy? So these were not opened up. Finally, final word, gesturing back to what I said about Cape Town and South Africa at the beginning, is that I think the African debate is polarized between two groups today. If we give them names, the names they gave to one another, they have given to one another, nativists on the one hand and modernists on the other hand. You know, nativists are determined that the only solution for Africa is to return to what existed before colonialism. And modernists are determined that there's no return. The only way forward is to embrace modernity. Right? And this standoff is where we are right now. Thank you.